Welcome to Study Loop.
For this question, we're looking at this organic soup model to try and explain the origins of life. So what this organic soup is about is we know that the atmosphere in that prehistoric Earth consisted of different molecules: ammonia, hydrogen, water, and methane. And from these molecules, in the presence of some sort of electric or energy source, you're able to convert these into amino acids and make up proteins. And we know that proteins are the base substance required to make life. So here they're proposing that the presence of these molecules allowed for the random formation of life over a long period of time. However, there are several complications that have to be addressed in this matter. So for A, we're looking at the problems with these proteins themselves. The first thing we have to consider is the presence of biopolymers in different forms. So amino acids can settle in either a left-handed form or a right-handed form, so either L or D. The thing is, we only witness L being used in life. There are rare forms of D amino acids being found in certain organisms, but we primarily look at the L form. So the issue with this is if these molecules are going to randomly assemble together to make those amino acids, we should have an equal distribution of about 50% to 50% of these L to D forms. So it isn't very consistent that we're going to see primarily 100% in the L form with only rare contributions of the D form, if we originally started from this 50 to 50. Based on this theory, life should compose of an equal distribution of these L and D forms. So that's the first issue to address. The second issue to address is the presence of peptide bonds. So during this experiment, where these scientists combined these gaseous molecules in the presence of energy and electricity, these amino acids were not bound together. So here we only have the presence of amino acids and no presence of proteins. And we know that amino acids are not sufficient enough to give rise to the complex proteins we see in life. So without these peptide bonds being formed, it's hard to make the conclusion that we're able to make life from the formation of these amino acids if they are not able to bond together to make proper proteins. For the third part, we're considering the process of UV radiation affecting the molecule of ammonia. So UV radiation is going to break down ammonia, so it can no longer be combined into the amino acids required for proteins. So that's the first issue. What we do know, though, is that we can use the gaseous molecule of nitrogen in order to form them, but this requires the work of certain proteins in order to convert it into ammonia to make that proper form. However, you can't have proteins unless you have them originally formed from these gaseous molecules. So you can't have proteins without ammonia, but you can't have ammonia without nitrogen being converted into these protein molecules. So that creates that chicken and the egg model that they are explaining, that you can't have one without the other. So it's hard to determine whether we had ammonia come first, it's going to make proteins, and those proteins are able to convert nitrogen into that ammonia source. Or whether we start with our ammonia source, we have some sort of proteins existent that are able to convert that gaseous nitrogen into ammonia. So it's hard based on the presence and requirement of this protein in the absence of that ammonia molecule. For part B of this organic soup theory, they're asking us about the complications of nucleotides inside of this factor. So during this experiment, we don't have the presence of any nucleotides being formed. And we know that nucleotides are responsible for DNA and RNA, which are required to assemble those proteins. And without either of these two structures, you can't really have a reliable source of life. So that's the first issue, that those nucleotides aren't even present. The second issue is that the temperature is also incompatible with those nucleotides. So the temperature of Earth back in those prehistoric times was too high to support the accumulation of nucleotides to form DNA and RNA. So again, you're not going to be able to create that consistent form of proteins in that environment. For the third part, the UV radiation is also a concern for the formation of nucleotides. We know that there was little oxygen in the atmosphere at those times, and UV radiation has the capabilities to break apart DNA and RNA molecules. So again, you're going to have complications forming those reliable structures or coding sequences to make proteins. For the fourth part and ongoing, we know that we can make ATP inside of UV radiation, and we know that ATP is required for making energy needed to sustain life. So that at least is a viable option. However, we have complications with the formation of ribose, which is the sugar required for RNA formation. And RNA is going to be seen inside of your ribosomes, and again, it's responsible for making proteins as well as carrying out the functions of DNA and RNA. So it's complicated that it's not viable in the presence of UV because that complicates the further production of proteins inside the body. And it's also complicated that it would be created in the form of a racemar. So it's going to be either in that D or that L form. So it should occur in that 50-50 ratio, but again, we see the predominance of only that L form. So it doesn't make too much sense that life arose from the racemar formation or the equal distribution of both these D and L forms, since they should have been created equally, but we're only going to see that L form in most life organisms. So those present sort of complications to this theory that it may not be the most applicable or the most true hypothesis, and that there may be other explanations involved with this. Moving on to part C, we are talking about that panspermia theory. So this was a conclusion proposed by other scientists that we had meteors make contact with the Earth, and those were going to supply some of those amino acids, proteins, nucleotides, and other substances required for life. However, we also consider those two complications to this theory as well, namely the UV radiation as well as the production of RNA proteins. So the first part of this theory is that they're going to propose life came around those hot vents inside of the ocean. So you're going to have protection from UV radiation based on the presence of water. So that's going to allow for the formation of RNA, ribose, and those other necessary molecules needed to form life. So that's very helpful. You're also going to have a more suitable temperature, which allows for the formation of the nucleotides as well as the proteins. So that is slightly more viable than the other theories proposed based on the fixing of these complications. So those are no longer major concerns to the theory of where life began. So hot vents is actually a more viable option than, say, the introduction of those amino acids and nucleotides to the surface of the Earth, where they would still be exposed to those UV and temperature limitations. The other theory proposed, apart from panspermia, is the presence of RNA molecules. So here, our RNA molecules are important for the production of those proteins and such. And with the presence of RNA inside of our ribosomes, you're going to already have the production of proteins, and you're not going to require any of the nucleotides needed by DNA. So say a meteor was to introduce the molecule of RNA, this fixes some of the complications of the need of nucleotides because you're going to have the formation of proteins already from the formation of ribosomes from RNA. You're also not going to need that viable source of ribose from the beginning because it's already introduced in this RNA form. You're also not going to have complications with the conversion of ammonia in the presence of UV radiation because you already have the breakdown of nitrogen from nitrogenous gas. So you're able to use nitrogenous gas as that protein source in order to form your amino acids. So the introduction of RNA is also helpful to this theory because it simplifies some of those complications with the production of proteins without it, or the production of ribose and nucleotides without this pre-formed existence of RNA. Lastly, we can move on to part D, where they're going to propose other hypotheses that help explain the origination of life. So for the first part, they are giving us that hydrogen gradient that forms around some of those underwater volcano vents. And we know that hydrogen is responsible for the production of ATP inside of the mitochondria. And without this hydrogen or proton gradient, you're not going to be able to get that reliable formation of ATP. So with the presence of ATP or that proton gradient around those hot volcano vents, this proposes that there's actually that possibility for life to originate around there. That this proton gradient is kind of that precursor that allowed for life to form, develop that similar hydrogen gradient, and see those complex forms that would give rise to life that we see now. For the last part, we are talking about the formation of ribosomes through an autocatalytic nature. So what this means is we have those RNA molecules or those ribosomal RNAs, and they're going to cause the creation of proteins. And some of those proteins inside our body are responsible for the formation of RNA. So in general, RNA is responsible for the reproduction of itself. So there is what it means by that self-catalytic nature, in that RNA is going to be able to produce RNA. And this they're relating to the reliability of DNA or other nucleotides. So there are certain sequences we find in DNA or RNA that suggest it's possible to create them from its similar structure. So if any of the molecules on site of Earth were able to create DNA or those nucleotides, it's possible that they're able to also produce that self-catalytic nature to reproduce themselves. So that allows some of the clarification or simplification of some of those complications of that organic soup theory where we're not able to create those DNA or nucleotide molecules. Instead, with the presence of either of these, we're already simplifying and eliminating that complication because we're able to create them ourselves. So here, RNA leads to that precursor for the hypothesis that DNA and nucleotides may also have had some sort of function to self-replicate themselves in that manner. So those are some of the complications and sort of simplifications of the organic soup theory on how it can be reliable, how it can be unreliable, and how scientists are trying to either propose new solutions, trying to propose complications, further complications to this theory to search for another suggestion, or they are proposing certain mechanisms that eliminate those complication pathways and make it a more viable option to believe.